Thanks to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I hope all of you are well and staying safe in this strange environment that we're living in right now. I'm, as you can tell, working from home, and I will be probably until August. And then in August, our university is planning on going back to face-to-face classes, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and switch to my PowerPoint screen to share with you. So I'm going to disappear for just a second as I pull this up. All right, so you should be able to see that screen now. So just as a follow-up to Maria's very nice introduction, this is just, you can see here a little about me. I do work at Auburn University at Montgomery in Montgomery, Alabama, which for those of you who are not familiar with that location, that's in the South. We're right to the northwest of Florida, so in the very deep South. It's very hot here right now. And for the last years, I've spent my time working on various topics related to Russian-American relations, the history of Russian-American relations. And so this book that I'm going to talk about now, this research is the first book I did on the topic of Russian-American relations. I then followed that up with a book on the history of the Alaska Purchase, which came out in time for the anniversary in 1860, or in 2017 rather. And then I did 2 republications of memoirs from the Russian Revolution. These are interesting. They're both written by women. One was a journalist. The other was just a wife who was accompanying her husband to Russia, and both of them observed the revolution from very different perspectives. And so those are really interesting as well. But today we're going to be talking about Alexis in America. This is a topic that has been so much fun for me. It was really fun to research. I traveled to all of the places that Alexis visited, all the cities in the United States. And I also did research in Russia, of course, looking at his papers and his family papers. But it's just a really fascinating story. It involves a lot of interesting times and places and people from this period. It has a little bit of romance and a little bit of scandal. But it was an enormous and important moment in the history of Russian-American relations. And I first stumbled on it when I was working on my dissertation at Tulane University in New Orleans, because there's actually a strong connection between the history of Alexis's visit to the United States and Mardi Gras, the annual celebration that we have in New Orleans right before the beginning of Lent. So we'll get to that at the end of the lecture today. But let me just go ahead and begin by addressing what probably are some of the most common questions. Why was Alexis sent to the United States, and why at that particular moment? Well, first of all, it's important to realize, and you guys probably know this, that Russia and the United States actually had a pretty good relationship up until this point. They had relations based on trade and other sorts of things. More recently, during the American Revolution, Russia had sent a fleet to the United States. And although Russia had its own reasons for doing that, in the United States, this was seen by the North as a sign of Russian support during our Civil War. It's important to remember that other countries actually wanted to get involved in our Civil War, to take a side, but Russia was one of the few countries that said that it would not get involved in any kind of way. And so this, of course, made the United States view Russia as a friend. In addition to that, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in the United States only a couple years after Alexander II freed the serfs in Russia. And this made it seem as though Russia and the United States had a common bond as well. And then, of course, very close together at roughly the same time almost, Lincoln was killed, Lincoln was assassinated, and there was an assassination attempt on Alexander II. And so that seemed to be yet another thing that the two countries had in common. So there actually was quite a good relationship between Russia and the United States at this time. And so there had been some conversations about the possibility of Russia sending someone to visit, perhaps one of the royal sons to visit. But this had sort of been bounced back and forth for a few years and nothing had happened. And then finally, in 1870, late 1870, early 1871, it seems that Russia became interested in, or the Tsar became interested in sending someone to visit. And specifically, he decided to send his fourth son, Alexis. Now, Alexis is an interesting choice. He's not the heir to the throne. He's actually pretty far down the chain of command there. But there was a very specific reason that he chose to send Alexis. And that reason is because Alexis had become involved with a much older woman. She's pictured down at the right of this slide, Alexandra Zhukovskaya. You recognize the last name because her father, of course, was the famous poet, and he had served as a tutor at the royal court. So Alexandra was of noble blood, but she was not of royal blood. And at least for Alexis's first official relationship, he needed to marry a woman of royal blood. Later, he could have had a relationship with this woman, and it probably wouldn't have mattered very much. Royals often did that. People in royal families often had other relationships on the side, or later relationships with people who were not of royal blood. But the first relationship, the marriage, needed to be to someone of royal blood, and she was not. But Alexis was very much in love with her. And actually, by early 1871, when it was decided that Alexis would be sent to the United States, she was actually already pregnant with his child. So you can understand why Alexander II and his wife would have been very keen to send Alexis away for a while to try and cool down this relationship between him and Alexandra. So this was the personal reason behind sending Alexis. And then, of course, the political reason I just indicated a few moments ago. That would be that Russia and the United States had this great relationship, and both the United States and Russia were interested in continuing that relationship and maybe redefining it in the moments after Russia had gone through so many reforms and the United States had recovered from its civil war. Now, there were threats to this visit. There were some things that potentially could have ruined this visit. One of these was an assassination plot. So not long before Alexis arrived in the United States, the Russian minister there, whose name is on that bottom part of the slide, Konstantin Kadakazi, received some tips that there was an assassination plot, that Polish nationals living in New York City were plotting to kill Alexis when he arrived. And they did a bit of investigating, and I've actually looked at some of those letters in the archive, and it does appear that there were some people who were talking about this. But the plot was apparently not very well organized, and so it never was carried out. But it was enough of a threat that the Russian minister did inform the American government, and the American government did hire Pinkerton's detective agency to investigate the possibility of this plot and to uncover those who were associated with it. The second thing that threatened this visit was something called the Perkins Claim. This is a long story in and of itself, so I won't go into it entirely, but the important thing to recognize about this is that back in the Crimean War, so in the 1850s, a Russian agent had approached an American merchant about the possibility of buying guns and gunpowder from this American agent. So Russia's in the middle of a war and it's seeking more war material. This man named Benjamin Perkins met with Russian officials a number of times, and they agreed on some deals. He started to put everything together, and then suddenly Russia stopped being interested. And if you look at the records, it's clear that as the Crimean War was drawing to an end and it became clear to Russia that it was going to be signing a peace treaty, it was no longer interested in purchasing these goods. But in the meantime, this man had spent a lot of money getting these things together and renting ships and so on. And so he sued the Russian government, or he attempted to sue the Russian government in order to get the money that he had lost. He didn't really succeed, and several years went by. He eventually died. The claim was continued by his wife, and in 1867, when the United States was purchasing Alaska from Russia, there were people in the United States who were pressing this claim, attorneys who represented her, who tried to actually convince the United States government to withhold a portion of the payment for Alaska until this claim received a new examination. Now, ultimately, the Russian minister who was here at that time, the predecessor to Kadakazi, his name was Stokel. Stokel managed to persuade people not to follow through with this, but he promised that there would be a new examination of the claim by his successor, Konstantin Kadakazi. And so luckily for the Russian government and for the United States, of course, the Alaska purchase went through without any problems there. But that meant when Konstantin Kadakazi arrived, he had to deal with the Perkins Claim. And when Kadakazi arrived, he enthusiastically took on the challenge of trying to determine whether or not this claim was legitimate. Now, just a word about Kadakazi. Descriptions of him are pretty much universally unpleasant. It sounds like he was just not a great guy. He was abrasive and kind of pushy, and he stuck his nose into other people's business. And he quickly made enemies when he arrived in the American capital. And he began to investigate this claim, and he sort of decided right off the bat that it was not legitimate. And unfortunately, he used a lot of harsh words in describing those people who were supporting the claim, calling them crooks and criminals and all sorts of things like this. And this included members of the American government. And so, of course, he made enemies pretty quickly. Following that, he also did other things like putting stories in the newspaper about Russian-American relations. And as the Russian minister in a foreign country, he really wasn't supposed to do that. And some of this information sometimes suggested things that maybe were not entirely accurate. He also breached protocol in a number of other ways. Basically, he made himself unliked very, very quickly. And in fact, in the summer before Alexis was due to arrive, so in July of 1871, the American government was so irritated with Kadakazi, and they felt that he was such a threat to Russian-American relations that they asked that the Russian government recall him. And the Russian government responded that that was impossible because the Tsar's son was about ready to visit. So it wouldn't be appropriate for the Tsar's son to visit without the Russian minister there. And there was a lot of back and forth about this. Ultimately, the United States government agreed that they would tolerate, and that's the word they used, they would tolerate Kadakazi until the end of the Grand Duke's visit, but he would be persona non grata, and they would only speak to him in the capacity of the escort of the Grand Duke. And in fact, this scandal was so enormous, and it involves hundreds of pieces of correspondence and all sorts of complications, that I actually have decided, or I decided a while back, that this was going to be the subject of my next book. So this is actually the book I just finished the first draft of. I'm going to be sending it to the press very soon. It's called Russian-American Relations in the Time of Reform and Reconstruction, the Kadakazi Affair, and the Decline of Imperial Friendship. So I actually have written an entire book just about the Kadakazi Affair, because there are all sorts of interesting little side stories to this. So just to give you a little taste, for example, Kadakazi had stolen a wife away from her husband, and they fell in love, they got married. Then he took her to the United States, but because of that sort of scandalous past to his relationship, the other ladies of Washington did not want to associate with his wife, and this caused all kinds of stress and tension on the social scene in Washington. So, and this ultimately affected the political life as well. So anyway, it's Kadakazi himself is an entire story, but he caused enough trouble that he actually threatened the Grand Duke's visit. If the United States had not compromised at this point, the Tsar would have canceled the visit, and they had threatened to do so. All right. Oops, for some reason my slide is not moving. Just one second, please. Oops, Here we go. So this shows you the Grand Duke's entire trip through the United States. So he was here for 3 months, and you can see he covered a great deal of territory. He arrived in New York, and then you can see he traveled in the Northeast, and then he went into Canada, where he visited a couple of Canadian cities. He came back into the United States, made his way toward the Midwest, and then he traveled out west as far as Denver. Now, originally there was some talk about him going all the way to San Francisco. As you know, San Francisco had a Russian population there, and there was initially talk of him going that far, but the plan was changed later. Then he comes back to the Midwest again, and he heads down to the very deep South. New Orleans was the last city that he visited before he made his way to Pensacola and departed. Now you'll notice he didn't travel to any of the cities in the Southeast, and that's because they were simply still too torn up after the Civil War. So there was discussion about trying to go to Atlanta and Savannah at various points, but the railways and other forms of transportation there were still so hampered after the Civil War, the destruction of the Civil War, that it was decided that it wouldn't be a good idea to go there. So Alexis arrives in New York in November, late November of 1871, and he is given an enormous reception there. So one of the things I'll just tell you right here is that in all of the major cities he visited, there were enormous events held for him. These usually involved parades, balls, dinners, dances, theater performances, and in all of the major cities, the crowds came out in enormous numbers. And so while only the wealthy could go to the fancy events, only the wealthy could really get tickets to the balls and the theater and those kinds of things, common people could get a view of him on the streets. And he met lots of famous people because, of course, in every city, the people who were involved in the planning committee for all of his events were, of course, the most famous people in the city, the most famous businessmen, the most famous politicians, the most famous cultural figures as well. So you'll see some familiar names here. Samuel Morse is a familiar name as in the Morse code. William Vanderbilt, you've probably heard of the Vanderbilts, wealthy family. And then Henry Ward Beecher, his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the very famous novel which depicted the terrible effects of slavery, and a novel that, you know, has been credited with sort of really inspiring or energizing, I should say, the abolitionist movement in the United States that ultimately led to the freeing of the slaves. From New York, sorry, my slideshow is jamming again. There we go. From New York, Alexis went to Washington, D.C. And here he got to meet President Grant and Mrs. Grant and the members of the president's cabinet. One of the most important members of the president's cabinet was Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, who's pictured at the lower right of this slide. Hamilton Fish was the person who dealt with Katakazi on a day-to-day basis. So most of the correspondence that I've looked at regarding Katakazi is between Fish and Katakazi, the American correspondence anyway. And only occasionally does Ulysses Grant write anything about Katakazi. Usually Fish is the one who has written everything about that. And Fish was also the person who Katakazi contacted in making the plans for this visit to the White House. Now, traditionally, when someone visited the White House, there was usually a dinner or some kind of formal reception. But because of the circumstances regarding Katakazi and his situation, that he was persona non grata and they really didn't want to deal with him at all, the visit of the Grand Duke Alexis was very brief, and it was very, we'll say, cool in temperature. So for example, instead of a ball and a dinner and all this sort of thing, they had just a very brief meet and greet. It was very formal. There were no laudatory speeches, no welcomes, all this sort of thing that happened in all the other events. And then after there was an official introduction between the Grant administration and the Grand Duke and his party, the Grand Duke and the other gentlemen moved into a different room where they met all the ladies. And that was about it. It was very brief, and there was very little that took place. Unfortunately, that did sour the spirit of the visit, and it was decided at that point that the Grand Duke would not return to Washington. So there had been an invitation for him to come back to Washington at the end of his visit so that he could actually witness Congress in action. But it was decided not to go back to Washington because Russian officials felt that he had been treated a little bit shabbily in DC. And I will tell you that, you know, in the research I've done, years afterwards, this was brought up in Russia. So Americans in Russia, officials and official and not unofficial people in Russia said that this was brought up, that, you know, there was still a bit of a grudge. Alexander II and his wife were kind of mad that Alexis wasn't treated better in Washington, D.C. by the president. After visiting D.C., Alexis went to Philadelphia. And here he stayed at the Continental Hotel, pictured in the upper left. And one of the members of his welcoming committee was General George Meade, who was a hero of the Battle of Gettysburg. His name may not mean anything to you, but at the time he was a really, really big deal. What you see at the bottom of the screen is an invitation to the reception ball at the Academy of Music. And I just want to take a little aside here and just tell you that there are actually quite a surprising number of these original invitations and ball tickets and things like that that are still in existence. I own a few of them. I managed to get a couple of them off of eBay, but usually I am outbid by other collectors because I am a college professor and I don't have money to spend on tons of things like this. So there are people out there who actively collect these kinds of things. And so there are quite a number of them in private hands, but you can also find some of them in historical societies and libraries as well. But it's kind of interesting to see these things in person and hold them in your hands and realize that this was the thing that, you know, brought people together for the Grand Duke Alexis. And of course, in Philadelphia, as in the other big cities, there were all sorts of events arranged for the Grand Duke Alexis. He next went to the city of Boston, where he visited some of Boston's most famous historic sites, like City Hall and the Old State House. The Old State House, by the way, is still there. It's still a museum, an active museum that you can visit. He also met Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the very famous poet. From Boston, he traveled north to Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. And while he was there, he learned of the illness of the Prince of Wales. And so his visit there was a little more muted because of that. There was a great deal of concern about the Prince of Wales. And so all of the festivities were kind of toned down a little bit because of that. But he did visit Niagara Falls. In fact, he visited both sides of Niagara Falls. And he did a lot of the other typical things that we've described already as well. Leaving Canada, he went to Buffalo, he went to Cleveland, so Buffalo, New York, Cleveland, and Detroit, Michigan. And in those cities, he did some small things, but there was a lot less that happened in those cities, so I've kind of skipped over them. The next big city he visited was Chicago. And what's very interesting about this is that Alexis visited Chicago only weeks after the enormous fire that destroyed the city. So the Chicago fire occurred in mid-October, and Alexis was there in December. So it might surprise you that Alexis visited Chicago, or that city officials would have invited him to Chicago given the state of the city at that point. But, and I think if you think about the times when there have been enormous fires in Russia, such as the Great Moscow Fire of the 19th century, it's often important after a disaster for a city to demonstrate to themselves and to the outside world that they can come back, that they can move forward again. And so that's what city officials decided. They decided to invite Alexis They apologized to him for the fact that some of the festivities might be a little smaller and less extravagant than they would have been under other circumstances. But they wanted to demonstrate to themselves and everyone else that Chicago would come back as a great city. And so they invited Alexis, and he was able to tour the burn districts and witness some of the amazing heroics that had taken place, or learn about the amazing heroics that had taken place during the fire. Following Chicago, Alexis went to the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he stayed at the famous hotel, the Newhall House. He then moved on next to, my slide will move, St. Louis, Missouri. And he spent a bit of time here doing some of the same things that he'd done in other places. He also visited the famous Eads Bridge in St. Louis. And the engineer Eads, E-A-D-S, was the man who first figured out what's called caisson sickness, which is where when people go, it's essentially the bends that you get in scuba diving. But when they were building these enormous bridges and they were starting to sink these giant pillars into the bottom of rivers, they had to figure out how to deal with sending men into these low depths of water without them getting hurt and sick. And he was the first man to kind of figure out what was going on there. And so some of the techniques that Eads used in discovering or in building his bridge in St. Louis were then later used to build the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. From St. Louis, Alexis went out onto what is probably one of the most famous parts of his trip, and this is the buffalo hunt out west. So in the United States, when you mention the visit of Grand Duke Alexis, first of all, a lot of people have never heard of it. I'm trying to change that. Next year, 2021 is going to be the 150th anniversary of Alexis's visit, and so I'm trying to orchestrate events wherever possible so that people will remember this amazing story. But if people have heard of anything about the Grand Duke's visit, they have heard about the buffalo hunt, especially out west. There are a couple of museums out west that actually have some small displays about the Grand Duke Alexis buffalo hunt. So out west, the story is known a little more than it is in the other parts of the country. But this, of course, is an incredibly colorful part of Alexis's visit. He goes out west to hunt buffalo. Alexis had said early on that he was hoping to hunt in the United States. And were Buffalo Bill Cody, pictured on the left, and General George Armstrong Custer, pictured in this photograph with Alexis. Now, again, perhaps sorry about that, if that was visible to you. Perhaps for Russians, these names are not as familiar, but certainly for Americans, they're familiar. And especially at this time, these would have been household names. Everybody knew about the colorful lives of Buffalo Bill Cody and George Armstrong Custer. And so the idea of this Russian Grand Duke hunting with these two famous Americans, these men who already had this reputation of being kind of wild and brave and interesting, fascinating men, this just made the story even better. So you can understand why this would have gotten a lot of attention at the time and why more people might remember this part of the story even now. So Alexis and the men all went out buffalo hunting. They spent several days out there. There are wonderful stories, probably greatly exaggerated, about the fact that every time Alexis shot a buffalo, when he hit a buffalo, there would be lots of cheers and the popping open of bottles of champagne, so that all of the Americans who were there were really hoping that Alexis would shoot a lot of buffalo so that they could partake of more Russian champagne. There were also very silly stories about Alexis being a bad shot and having to have a a buffalo cub, or whatever you would call that, a buffalo calf tied down for him so he could shoot it. That's probably absolutely ridiculous because Alexis would have hunted. We know he hunted, so he was probably a good shot, but it made for, you know, silly stories in the newspapers. And then, of course, one of the things that the Americans arranged for Alexis and the other Russians was a visit from a tribe of Native Americans to come and perform some of their dances to demonstrate how they killed buffalo with arrows. And so this was an important part of Alexis's visit as well. He had hoped to meet Native Americans, and so that was part of his trip out west. And there's even some rumors about him flirting with one of the Native American young ladies. But again, that's probably exaggerated given the fact that he was still pining for Alexandra Zhukovskaya. From the west, they went back to the Mid-East. They went to Louisville, Kentucky, and Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. So for those of you who may not have heard of it, Mammoth Cave is an enormous cave in southern Kentucky or mid-Kentucky. It is open for visitors. It is just so enormous. I think it's one of the largest underground caves that's accessible for people. And this is something that they toured as well. Apparently, Alexis found it a little bit intimidating. In the one letter that he wrote to his mother while he was visiting the United States, he mentioned something about it being kind of frightful because, of course, the deeper you get into the cave, the darker it is. And there were some very narrow passageways, and it was written in the newspaper that Alexis and some of the other large men found it difficult to kind of squeeze through some of these tight spaces. Next, Alexis went to Memphis, Tennessee. So now he's getting into the really deep South. Here he stayed at the Peabody Hotel. Now this hotel, it no longer stands, but it was rebuilt, and there is still a hotel in Memphis called the Peabody. Unfortunately, they have no records of the original hotel and Alexis's visit. But Alexis, of course, was treated to balls and receptions and all those sorts of things here as well. And one of the people he met was Jefferson Davis. Now, this name probably rings a bell for you guys because Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. So he was the head of the southern section of the United States that broke off during the Civil War. He had been forgiven for that, and he had been pardoned for that, and so he was a free citizen, and he was one of the people that Alexis and his royal suite, his traveling party met while they were in Memphis, which I just think is very, very interesting because in many ways Jefferson Davis should have been persona non grata after what happened, but yet he was still included in these festivities. Next, Alexis sailed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans in Louisiana. And all of you know, I'm sure, about the celebration of Mardi Gras in New Orleans every year. It varies. The date depends on the date of Easter. And it is this enormous celebration that occurs for several weeks. And then the final day is on officially Mardi Gras. And then the following day, Lent begins, and everybody's supposed to be very good and behave themselves. But before that, everybody has a giant party, and there's lots of drinking and carousing and all sorts of other activities, including these parades with costumes and everything. Well, Alexis came to New Orleans, and it was the first time Mardi Gras was celebrated during the daytime, and a Mardi Gras organization called the Crew of Alexis was created that year. Now, let me just give you a little bit of background on this. Mardi Gras had been celebrated at night before this, and it was kind of unorganized and chaotic. This year in 1872, a group of wealthy businessmen in New Orleans got together and decided, for purposes of organization and also for reasons of tourism, because now by this point people were actually coming from other cities to go to Mardi Gras in Louisiana. They decided that they needed to organize Mardi Gras a little bit, and so they founded an organization. They called it the Crew of Alexis, and there was a king of Rex, and he made royal edicts, and he published these royal edicts in the newspaper asking people to close their businesses on Mardi Gras Day. He told them where they should meet in order to begin the parade, and so on and so forth. At the time, they knew Alexis was coming, but Alexis was not the reason for the organization of the Crew of Rex and the daytime celebration. He was just sort of an added bonus. However, the coincidence of these two events has meant that in many popular histories of Mardi Gras, they credit Alexis with the founding of Mardi Gras, but it really wasn't true. It was just a coincidence. However, I'm sure that the men who decided to organize the Crew of Rex were extremely excited that a member of the Russian royal family would be there at the same time, because that certainly lent a lot of excitement to their idea. Now, while Alexis was in the United States, there was an enormous amount of excitement about it. And I call this Alexis Mania, because there were so many funny things that appeared in the newspapers as a result of Alexis's visit. So one of the things that we see is that there was lots of advertising that used Alexis's name in it. So for example, there were hats named Alexis hats. There was soap named after Alexis. Sewing machines, stoves, champagne. So for example, ads would use things, they would use Alexis's name, and they would say things like, well, Alexis saw this sewing machine in this shop and is thinking about buying one to bring it back to Russia, so you should come and get one as well. Or this was the champagne that was served at the Alexis Ball in New York, so you should buy some of it. So they tried to use Alexis's name to advertise things or to attract people to their products or their stores. There were also some products that were specifically named after Alexis. So there was an Alexis hair tonic. There were these weird shoes that were named after Alexis. There were these giant platform shoes. I don't know why anybody thought those should be Alexis shoes, but they were. And also I saw advertisements for a lot of Russian themed jewelry during this as well. So I thought that was really interesting also. The other thing is that a lot of people wrote really bad poetry about Alexis, and I probably have 20 or more examples of long poems, really long poems that people wrote about Alexis, in which they make some really awful rhymes with his name. And I just clipped one little example for you here so you could see it. This poem goes on much, much longer, but you can see this part. There's a Muscovite youth named Alexis, who an officer first of the deck is, and he came here to see what this country might be, ere our land to his own he annexes. So this is just one example of the really bad poetry that was written before, during, and after Alexis's visit. And finally, this last part here, women. So we know that Alexis was madly in love with Alexandra Zhukovskaya before he came to the United States. And I know from reading his letters to his family that he never stopped pining for her while he was here. His letters to his parents are actually incredibly sad. When I read them, I felt like I was reading almost like something I shouldn't be reading, because they were so personal. And they were exactly the kinds of letters you would expect to read between a young man who was at the time, by the way, 21. He turned 22 during the buffalo hunt. So a very young man who's madly in love. His lover is pregnant and expecting his child, and his parents have sent him to the other side of the world. So the letters are exactly what you would expect. So Alexis pleads with his parents and says that he loves her and he wants to be with her, and he has a responsibility to her and his child. And his parents write back, you know, we're done talking about this. We've already made ourselves clear. Why do you keep bringing this up? At one point, Alexander II chastises Alexis because he hasn't asked about his mother's health recently, and Alexander feels that that is an intentional way of hurting his mother. So there's, you know, just this really, you know, deep family drama going on between Alexis and his parents. And the man who's traveling with him as his guardian is an admiral, Admiral Poisson, and he writes back to the Tsar, constantly letting the Tsar know how Alexis is doing, and and of course what the reception is like, and all of these other things as well. And Posset writes back to Alexander that Alexis cries about Alexander sometimes, and they talk about it, and he's trying to make sure that Alexis keeps looking forward, but that Alexis is very sad a lot of the time. And the admiral says, if at any point during the trip I feel worried that this woman's gonna, then we're going to just pass that port and keep going. So we know that Alexis was still passionately in love, but of course Americans didn't know that. And you can imagine what the American press made of the notion of a young, handsome, tall Russian Grand Duke traveling through the United States. They made it sound as though he was looking for a bride. They reported a lot on how women reacted to Alexis. So they reported about the women who were, hanging around outside of his hotel, or the women who were trying to get into his hotel room, or the women who sent him letters or gifts. They reported about every woman he danced with. And so they made a really big deal out of it. And every place Alexis traveled, he gave away a lot of gifts. Now, he gave gifts to lots of people, men and women, but of course it's not surprising that he gave very elaborate gifts to women, and so he gave some really amazing jewelry to some women, and the press made a lot of that. In particular, they made a lot of his gifts to one woman, Lydia Thompson, who was a burlesque performer. Alexis had seen her performing in St. Louis, and he gave her a bracelet, an amazing bracelet afterwards. And it just so happened that Lydia was then going to be performing in New Orleans at about the same time that Alexis was there in New Orleans. And so this began a rumor that Alexis was following Lydia to New Orleans. Well, of course, this isn't true either, because she, in fact, or he in fact was already scheduled to go there, as was she. So it was just a coincidence that they were both going to be in the same place. But this actually led to another rumor about Mardi Gras. One of the songs from Lydia's performance, a play that she was performing called Bluebeard, was a song called If Ever I Cease to Love. And this became the theme song for the Mardi Gras organization, the Crew of Rex. And to this day, in America, in newspapers in New Orleans or in books in New Orleans, you will see references that say that the song was chosen because Alexis was infatuated with Lydia Thompson, but that's just not true. But again, it made for a good story. All right, so everything I've told you so far, I hope has been very interesting to you. I hope that it's demonstrated to you what an interesting story this is and how it was filled with colorful stories and people. But there also are some larger significances here that I want to point out before we end the talk today. So one thing I want to point out is in the United States, there were a number of issues that were raised by the visit of the Grand Duke. The first one is regionalism. So 1871-72, this is just a couple years after the end of the American Civil War. And yet what the newspaper reports about the Grand Duke's visit show is that there was still a great deal of regionalism. So there was still a lot of sense of the difference between North and South. So Northern newspapers made nasty comments about Southern cities hosting the Grand Duke, but more often Southern newspapers, especially in places like New Orleans, made a big deal out of the fact that they were capable of hosting a Grand Duke just like the North. So we see a lot of regionalism still existing in the way in which the newspapers reported on this. In addition, we see a lot of competition between cities. So again, this might not be familiar to you, but it certainly would be to Americans at the time. There was a lot of competition between cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, as sort of, which city would be America's first city, which city would be the cultural capital, which city would be the business capital of the country. And so we see a lot of kind of nastiness in the newspapers between cities as they criticized how the other was taking care of Alexis. So they made fun of the other city about how they had hosted Alexis, and then they made comments about how they would do a better job or how they had done a better job. Another thing that we see emerging in this is racism. Now, this is after the Civil War. Blacks have been freed, but of course they are by no means equal. But you do have some successful Black politicians, Black businessmen who by all rights should have been included in these festivities, should have been invited to some of these things, and they were not. And at the time, there were discussions of this. So these people who were shorted, who were not allowed to participate, complained about it, or others complained on their behalf. And so there were actually accusations of racism. It was pointed out that certain people, certain Black businessmen who had as much money as other white businessmen were not invited. So it's interesting that these kinds of conversations were happening at this early stage. We also see conversations about classism. So I mentioned to you in the very beginning that only the rich people, only people with money and connections could get into these balls and banquets and other kinds of festivities. Common people could see Alexis on the streets, at parades and other public events. They often waited for him at train stations and other places along train lines so that they could wave to his train. And Alexis would often go out onto the back of the train and wave. But only the wealthiest and most connected people got to see the Grand Duke and meet him face to face. And there were criticisms of that in the newspapers. The fact that this man had come to see America, and yet he wasn't really seeing all of America. He was only seeing privileged America. So again, that's an interesting thing that was raised. You might be surprised to learn also that animal rights were raised as well. So the ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was founded not long before Grand Duke Alexis came to the United States. And while Grand Duke Alexis was here, he did go hunting a couple of times. He hunted pigeons in one city, and of course he hunted buffalo out west. And when they hunted buffalo, they basically just left the carcasses on the ground when they left. So there were a couple, they did keep some buffalo tails and some buffalo heads and a few things like that, but a lot of that stuff was just left behind. And so there were criticisms in the newspapers about the hunting, and there were comments specifically about, what would the ASPCA think about this? The other thing that's interesting and was really interesting for me is the fact that, the way American people reacted to the visit of a member of a royal family. So the United States separated itself from Great Britain because it no longer wanted to be ruled by a foreign power. And it specifically chose not to have that form of government. We set up a form of government here without a monarchy. And yet, when the Grand Duke Alexis comes, people are falling all over themselves to get just a glimpse of this guy. And so there was a lot of hand-wringing and sort of, self-examination in the newspapers about what this all meant. And people asked the question, why are we Americans falling all over ourselves for royalty? And he wasn't even the heir to the throne. And there were a lot of questions about what did this mean for our national identity? And of course, again, at this moment, right after the Civil War, I think, feelings were heightened about this question of what are we going to be as a country moving forward? And so, this question about why are Americans, at all levels, right, but especially Americans in power, why are they falling all over themselves to meet a member of royalty? What's interesting is that the greatest opposition to Alexis's visit came from foreigners living here in the United States. So foreign nationals, people who had left their own countries and come to the United States so they could live in a democratic society. So I already mentioned the Polish nationals who were talking about assassinating Alexis, but you also had Germans in the area of Milwaukee who were very vocally opposed to Alexis's visit. You also had people in other parts of the country, in Memphis and New Orleans, who complained about this as well. And so it's interesting that it was the foreign nationals who had moved here who were almost more critical of the way Americans were behaving than Americans themselves, or recognized more the hypocrisy than Americans themselves. And finally, I just want to point out what an important moment this was in the history of U.S. and Russian relations. So the United States and Russia had had this very good relationship for so long, but then in recent years, there have been some significant challenges, not just to their relationship with each other, but internally, each country had gone through significant challenges of reform and reconstruction. And now, after both countries are kind of, figuring out what their new world is going to look like after emancipation, after the Civil War. This was an important moment, and there were lots of very positive speeches during Alexis's visit that focused on the U.S.-Russian friendship and the fact that they had these things in common and that they had been friends for so long. Unfortunately, as we'll see, it would be the high point in U.S.-Russian relations, because soon after things would start going downhill. And of course, one of the reasons for that was, in fact, Katakazi, because for all the goodwill that Alexis built up while he was here, Katakazi was destroying it just about as quickly. Okay, so I want to conclude here with just some information about how the visit has been remembered. It's very interesting. There are lots of ways in which the visit has been remembered. I'm going to point out just a couple of them. So in subsequent years, when women got married, oftentimes in their wedding announcements, it would actually say that they had danced with Grand Duke Alexis. I think this is an amazing thing. In the United States, it's tradition when a woman gets married that there is a wedding announcement in the paper. And that wedding announcement usually talks about who the bride is and who her parents are and, you know, what the wedding is going to look like or what the wedding did look like. It tends to focus on the bride and her family. But at this moment in time, if you danced with Alexis, that was a big deal. And so that was actually mentioned in people's wedding announcements, which I think is pretty remarkable. I also found, of course, mentions of his visit in letters. So, of course, if you lived in any of these cities, or even if you didn't get to see him, you probably would have mentioned this in a letter if you were writing to a family member. So I found letters that talked about this as well. And then finally, obituaries. So again, in the United States, when someone dies, we put obituaries in the newspapers, or that was the tradition when we still had lots of newspapers. And what I found is that people who were associated with his visit were mentioned, this was mentioned in their obituaries when they died. So for example, restaurant owners, hotel managers, people like that who had some part in hosting the Grand Duke, when they died, this was mentioned in their obituaries. I'll just kind of move down a little bit because I know we're running out of time, but there were also commemorative toys and guns made in memory of the Grand Duke's visit. There have been museums and commemorative balls and dinners that have reenacted various parts of the Grand Duke visit or commemorated the Grand Duke's visit in various ways. And as I mentioned to you, next year is the 150th anniversary. And if coronavirus doesn't ruin everything, I actually do have some organizations that plan to hold commemorative dinners and lectures. So hopefully that'll all go off next year. One other very interesting thing is that there was an organization founded in New Orleans, a Mardi Gras organization in memory of Alexis. It's called the Crew of Alexis. It existed for 4 years in the 1920s, and then no one knows why, but it disappeared, and then it resurfaced in 1975, and it is still ongoing today. So every year, the Crew of Alexis has a ball, and they have this gigantic ball where people dress in what they believe to be Russian costumes. So there is someone who chooses a theme, like the court of Ivan the Terrible or something like that. And then they do some research and they come up with costumes that they think are appropriate for that era. And people dress in these costumes for the ball every year. So that still goes on today. Finally, I want to tell you about this, very interesting. So for 10 years, this flyer on the left shows you that there was an event in Nebraska called the Grand Duke Alexis Rendezvous. And each year people got together and they dressed up in costumes and they pretended to be the characters from the Grand Duke Alexis Buffalo Hunt. You can see the man pictured played Alexis. He actually was much too old to play Alexis, but I guess it was difficult to find someone 22 who wanted to do it. And there were also people who played Buffalo Bill and Custer and other famous men of the American West, and they often got Native Americans to come out and dance, and they would have they would serve buffalo stew or buffalo steak, that kind of thing. And this went on for 10 years. I was actually able to go to it a couple of years in a row, and it was a lot of fun. And the people there were so just in love with Grand Duke Alexis and the whole story of his visit. And they took it very seriously, and they knew a lot about it. And so it was a lot of fun to be around them. I'll also point out that in New York, in the Yacht Club, there's a buffalo head hanging on the wall, which they say came from the Grand Duke Alexis buffalo hunt. So apparently it was given to another organization, and then it was later passed on to the Yacht Club, and it hangs there in their club in New York City. So you probably want to know what happened to Alexis at the end of his life. Well, Alexis's parents could see that he was not over Alexandra, and so they decided it was too soon for him to come home, and so they continued his visit. They told him he needed to keep traveling. So when he left New Orleans, he took a train to Pensacola. There, the Russian fleet had sailed down, and they met him, and he boarded the fleet, and he continued to travel. He went to South America, so he went to Rio de Janeiro, and he went to, I'm trying to think where else, I'm drawing a blank now, but he went to a couple of places in South America. He went to India. He then made his way all the way to the east, and he went to Japan and China, and then he finally returned home almost exactly 2 years after he had left. By this time, Alexandra had moved to Germany. She eventually married another man, but at some point, and it's unclear when, the son who she had named Alexis did get brought into the royal family in Russia, and he became a, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? An assistant at court to one of Alexis's relatives. So it's clear that he was brought back into the fold. When the younger Alexis had a family of his own, Duchess Alexandra, the last, and Nicholas, of the last royal family, Alexandra was actually the godmother to the younger Alexis's children. So we know that he was brought closely back into the family, but I was never able to find a lot of information about what the relationship was between Alexis and his son. When Alexis stayed in Russia, he never married, although he was always known to have a beautiful woman on his arm. He became the head of the Russian fleet, and unfortunately he served in that position at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, which of course was a terrible defeat for Russia, and so he was discredited and he resigned and moved to Paris, and he died in Paris in 1908 at the age of 58. And that is the end of his sad story. So it's sort of a sad story for Alexis in that he never did find that true love again. I like to think that, you know, Alexandra was his true love, and he just never met anyone who matched that. But he wasn't short on lady friends for the rest of his life. And that is the end of my talk. So I am happy to take questions at this point. I'm going to go ahead and unshare my screen so that I can see the chats and see if there are any questions. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I see a question about, let's see. Okay, so who paid for Alexis's visit? So Alexis brought a lot of money of his own, or the Russian government's money, obviously, to pay for things like his hotel rooms and places and things like that. But a lot of the expenses in the United States were paid for by groups here. So the U.S. government paid for a few things related to the buffalo hunt, that sort of stuff. But mostly the individual cities picked up the tab for Alexis's visit. So in some places, it was the wealthiest people who got together and donated their carriages and their horses, and they paid for certain things. In a lot of places, those balls raised a lot of money by selling tickets, which allowed for them to pay for it. Mostly Alexis paid for his hotel rooms, but in some cities, I'm pretty sure that the hotel rooms were donated. Alexis gave away a lot of gifts, as I said earlier. He also gave away a lot of money. So sometimes he gave away money to the hotel for their staff who had taken care of him. In Boston, he gave away money for the poor in the city. And in Chicago, he gave away money for for just the recovery of the city, you know, for people who needed help recovering. Let's see, what else? Have there been any similar voyages by American presidents into the Russian Empire? So no. President Grant did go visit Russia after the end of his second term. His visit was much smaller, so it didn't cover nearly as much territory. And interestingly enough, this is one of those examples of where it seems that the Tsar was still kind of holding a grudge. When President Grant went to visit Russia in 1870, I'm trying to remember the exact year, 77, I think, Alexander II did not invite him to dinner. So that was sort of, I think, a little, you know, a little stab for not inviting Alexis to dinner many years earlier. One thing I will mention to you, though, is that, you know, there were other foreigners who visited the United States and went on these kinds of big trips, but none of them covered as much territory as Alexis. So I think that's interesting because it means that, you know, more Americans were part of this visit. More Americans were actually able to see Alexis. If they could, even if they could just be on the train line and wave to his train as he went by, they could follow it in the newspapers. Because of course, by this time there were lots more newspapers, and newspapers all over the country covered this, even in cities where he wasn't expected to visit. So I think that there was a greater sort of public awareness and public interest in Alexis's visit than there was in any previous visit by a famous foreigner. Okay, let's see, what are some, how did that trip affect Russian-American diplomatic relationship? I think I've mentioned that. If somebody has a more specific question for that, I'd be happy to answer that. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer any other questions. I do think it was the peak of the U.S.-Russian relationship. As I said, you know, the scandal with the Russian minister was going on at the same time. So even as people were on a popular level, were celebrating the connection between the United States and Russia and all the things that we had in common and all the things that we liked about each other. On that very upper political level, there were a lot of hard feelings. And so this, I think, kind of started the decline. And of course, over the next couple of decades, things would just get worse as, you know, Russia and the United States found that they had less and less in common. When Alexander II was assassinated in 1881 and he was succeeded by his son, Alexander III, as you well know, Alexander III was less liberal. And, you know, not surprisingly, he reacted to his own father's death with greater conservatism and repression. This made it harder for the United States to find common ground. And then the United States began to be very sensitive to the issue of how the Jewish population was being treated in Russia at the time. And so that became a point of friction as well. And so things just kept getting worse after this. And then, of course, you have the Russian Revolution, and then the United States and Russia don't have anything in common for a good long time. Any other questions? If no one has any other questions, I hope that I'll see some of you next week when I have my, my lecture on Donald Renshaw and his time in Russia, overseeing the Russian famine relief after the Russian Civil War, after the revolution.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Друзья, спасибо большое за то, что были сегодня с нами. И хочу еще раз напомнить вслед за Ли о том, что через неделю в это же время у нас состоится 3-я лекция из цикла «Истории российско-американских отношений». По всем вопросам вы можете писать к нам на нашу почту, обращаться к нам в наших соцсетях. Так что все ссылки будут там. До встречи через неделю. Thank you so much, Lee.
Sure, bye.
Bye.